the world is getting sick of it. I mean, the world outside of the collective West is getting sick of this mentality, sick of this treatment. I mean, it's not just, I mean, Russia and China, yes. You mentioned India, you even had Saudi Arabia. These countries are sick of this attitude. Biden went begging to Saudi Arabia saying, pump more oil, bring the prices down for us because midterm elections are coming up. And there's a whole lot of considerations there. But Saudi Arabia said, absolutely not. And a big reason was because of the way it's treating Russia. And so let's talk about this world trend then, this response, I think, to this kind of treatment. Because right now, China's holding, a lot of people, I cover China a lot here, is holding its 20th Communist Party of China National Congress. Every 5 years it occurs. China and Russia are incredibly close now. And a lot of people argue it's just because of, the West Stream. I think that's a major reason. I think both are undergoing very similar processes where there's military encirclement right at their doorstep. But they also have a lot of genuine interests, genuine reasons independent of that to get together. I wanted to get your impression of this, what some are calling an alliance, really a deep relationship of cooperation. And what does it mean going forward? Because the United States, the collective West as a whole, I mean, they are just rabidly just spewing aggression against this phenomenon, and it's scaring them quite gravely. So I want to know your impression of it and its relationship to this crisis around Ukraine.
Yes, what I think has happened is that for a very long time, of course, the relationship between China and Russia was something that people in the West were denying. I mean, I can remember a couple of years ago, I was starting to see the first sort of glimmers that this relationship between the Chinese and the Russians was evolving into something rather tighter than it had previously. I mean, China and Russia have been friendly countries on good terms since the late 1980s, early 1990s. But at some point in the 2000s, it began to get closer still. And a lot of people in the West saying this isn't happening. It's not really true. These two countries aren't friends. They're really enemies or frenemies. That this relationship is not based on anything solid. And in fact, of course, it is based on something very solid. And I talked about Russian pursuit of national interests. Of course, China also pursues national interests. And at the moment, the national interests of China and Russia are aligned with each other. They are both under pressure from the same bloc, the United States and its friends. They both feel themselves in need of the support of the other. Each has a lot of what the other needs. So China has this enormous manufacturing capacity, it's an enormous economy, much bigger than Russia's on a completely different scale, but it's this enormous manufacturing economy, this enormous technology base. Russia is enormously rich in raw materials, vast, it could keep China fed, provided with oil and gas, strategic minerals, all those sort of things. So it is natural for them, when they find themselves under this kind of pressure, to start working together, to coordinating foreign policy positions, to developing military partnerships, to building up this relationship that they have with each other. Now, the point was, what was started out as being natural is now, I think, over the last couple of years, developing into something further, in the sense that they still deny that they are allies, because of course they don't want to say, we are allies, because if we say we are allies, then other countries, India, for example, might say, well, we have problems with China. Now you, Russia, you're telling us you're China's ally. Maybe that isn't going to be good for us. I mean, we're not happy with that. And you can see other countries, Pakistan, for example, historically had a prickly relationship with Russia. And, they're very good relations with China. And they might say, well, suddenly you become friends with our historic enemies. So on the one hand, the Chinese and the Russians want to keep a kind of cloak, a kind of distance. They want to make it out that, we're actually strategic partners. We're not quite allies. even though they work together very intimately, very closely, far more intimately and closely than they did in the 1950s, for example, when they were formal allies. But at the same time, they want to preserve this distance. They want to preserve this ambiguity because it works to the advantage of each. It means that they can preserve their connections with all their friends. And it also means that when one country finds itself involved in a crisis like the one in Ukraine, the other, in this case China, isn't obligated to rush immediately to the defense of the other. Behind the scenes, all kinds of things may be going on. They may be the Chinese may be providing the Russians with semiconductors, for example, to keep Russian factories running. But openly, China can maintain a neutral position and Russia isn't bothered. And of course, the same applies in over so many other things. So it works to their advantage to cast a cloak, a veil over the extent to which they are actually friends and perhaps allies. If you drill down to the bottom, is not too strong a word.
Yeah, anything you want to add, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, the entire collective West, I think they completely misread this entire situation. I mean, what did they expect was going to happen if they kept on pushing both Russia and China? I mean, what did they think was going to happen? I think about, where we are in the world today, and I just wonder, where's all this money that goes to these think tanks and to these huge government organizations and all these bright minds that are graduates of Stanford and Princeton and Harvard and all these people that write all these policy papers and have such a clear understanding of the world? I mean, they couldn't see this coming. There was not one person that could talk to multiple presidents in the United States or multiple leaders in the European Union or in the UK and just tell them, if we keep on poking at these countries, they may end up together because the one country has what the other one needs, and it seems like it's a pretty nice fit. I mean, this is obvious stuff, but it's almost like they completely ignored it, maybe because of their ego, their arrogance, their narcissism. I don't know what it is, but this was completely predictable. 10 years ago, this was predictable.
Right. Yeah, 10 years ago. Yeah. Alexander, do you want to?
No, what I just wanted to quickly add is I think it's also partly wishful thinking. I mean, you don't want to face the possibility that China and Russia might be working together, but also a very selective view of history, which is, of course, a lot of the people who, set up the think tanks, they are people who were active in the last years of the Cold War. And they think of Russian-Chinese relations through the framework of the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s and 1970s. And they assume that this is somehow the natural relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, that they're fundamentally antagonistic to each other. The reality is that Russian-Chinese relations have a very, very long history, going back to the late 17th century, when China and Russia first encountered each other. They first established diplomatic contacts. There was a Russian presence in Beijing throughout the 18th century, at a small level, but it was there. Russians were even allowed by the Chinese government at that period to sit the examinations, go through the Chinese examination system, which gave the Russians a cadre of people who knew China. And they've had their ups and downs. There have been times when they've been very friendly. There have been times when they've been less friendly. They were very friendly in the 1920s, for example. Sun Yat-sen and the Bolshevik government were on very good terms. The Soviets had good relations with Chiang Kai-shek's government at various times. They were allies against the Japanese. The Soviets playing a complicated game there because they didn't want to get into a war with the Japanese. But it's a complicated, very involved history. It can't just be reduced to that one period of the Sino-Soviet split. But that is what a lot of people in the West like to do.
Yeah, yeah, and I was thinking, as you were speaking, Alex, you were talking about why couldn't they have seen this coming? I mean, some of this feels like, I mean, there was an agenda that it was spoken clear. I mean, even 10 years ago, you all were following this, the pivot to Asia, and then you had all of these deployments, NATO forces, NATO resources along Russia's borders happening at the same time, and then you had the grand strategy of great power competition. Now Biden calls it strategic competition. It's the same thing. It's just more aggression toward Russia and China for regime change, and that's what it's felt like. And then so these same think tank experts and wonks, whatever they are, they, since the beginning of the Ukraine situation, or at least the special military operation, they've been talking about China being the mediator. China needs to basically get its pal over there and do what's best for the world. Meanwhile, the collective West is bringing us to this very, very, very dangerous crisis point, one that has gotten the question of nuclear war on the table.